However you want to run it. I'm a big believer in like rules of the game. If you're invited and that's your chance for that conference. Because I'm like you, people start stuff off. Frankly, I don't care if it casts upside. I mean, like, you're taking away other people's time. So, I mean,
I think as long as we have 15 trainers.
So I'm second or third. What do you think?
Well, how about second?
Jacob, do you have a, is yours about philosophical?
Mine is philosophical.
So I can imagine,
So the Victoria added.
Helps explain the errors of my ways.
Alright, seriously, one of you has to sit with me. I feel very alone over here.
Sure. And then, so since your bios are. Yeah, no. Okay.
Thank you for making me not alone over here.
Oh, sorry.
These dudes. I didn't want to be alone.
Now we are recording.
Yeah, right.
Welcome back. Thanks so much. That was a terrific start to the day. We have another great panel now, and since you have the bios of all our panelists, I again won't give them the introductions that they deserve. I'll just let you know that we have Victoria Schaffer, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Victoria Schaffer, who will be talking about nudges in health policy. Then we'll have Adam Smith, who will be talking about utilizing behavioral insights without romance, an inquiry into the choice architecture of public decision making. And then finally, Jacob Goldin will round out the panel talking about nudging without paternalism. So thank you very much.
Well, you know you haven't made it yet when the program has your name spelled wrong. So I'm Schaffer without a C. And my only other complaint is that I swear Tom promised that I would get to sit up there in the judge's chamber. But no luck. So today I'm going to talk about nudges for health policy. And this work is really work that is done in collaboration with a lot of important folks that I'll mention towards the end. But we are a group that's organized by the Behavior Science and Policy Association, and we were commissioned to produce a white paper for the White House Social and Behavioral Sciences team on behavioral insights for health policy. So this is really a subset of that paper that I'm talking about today. So before I get into that, I think I'm the first person here to talk about healthcare, and so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what are some of the problems with healthcare that we're trying to address with health policy. And that was my only reason for bringing my own personal laptop, so I can have these dramatic effects of rocks dropping. Later there will be flames, so watch at home. Okay, so what are some of the primary problems that the U.S. has? Well, the U.S. spends far greater fraction of their income on healthcare than our peer nations, and we don't get a lot of bang for our buck. So we suffer from some of the lowest life expectancy at birth, the highest infant mortality rate, and comparatively high prevalence of obesity and chronic diseases. We also have a number of health outcomes that are they vary substantially by income and race and ethnicity. And we have a whole section of older adults who don't have health insurance, right? So this is a problem here for us. So one tool that the government can use to combat these challenges is the use of health policy. And there are very many approaches that we could take to shaping health policy, but the tool up for discussion today is the use of a nudge from the framework of libertarian paternalism. And I'm going to go ahead and define what I mean by nudge. As you can see from the earlier panel, there's a wide variety of nudges that exist. My definition is fairly textbook. It's any aspect of choice architecture that influences behavior in a predictable way, but here's a couple of important pieces. Doesn't remove choices, so we're not constraining choices, nor does it significantly change the incentives associated with those choices. A couple other important points about health policy. Health policy is just simply not like other policy domains. Nudges have delivered profound successes in other domains, but it's unlikely that nudges are going to have similar successes in the domain of health policy. So why is that? So here's another problem about getting older. I can't quite see my computer very well, so I'm going to have to get a little closer sometimes. So number one, there is a unique set of economic and political forces that shape our health policy landscape. So we're a little different here in health policy. Number two, we're trying to address some really complex health behaviors. And these complex health behaviors are rooted in deep cultural and social norms. And so to do this, we really need some comprehensive and multidimensional policy responses. Okay. So this is changing health behaviors of this magnitude are going to require some more sophisticated coordination of both traditional economic policies, so these will be things like taxes, and behaviorally informed strategies, these are things like nudges. Okay. So if you look historically at some health behaviors that we've been able to move, smoking is a great example. Smoking has declined substantially in the last 10 to 20 years, but it has done so with the joint administration of things like taxes, restrictions on advertising, and public smoking bans. So the point here is that while nudges will be effective, you'll see that I am an enthusiast. They're just one of several tools that we have in our toolbox that we'll need to leverage against these really difficult health behaviors. Okay, so where have nudges been effective? So in this section, I'm going to talk about 3 bodies of literature and give you a couple examples from each. The first is, and there's the flames I was promising, promotion of healthy eating. So nudges have been really successful at promoting healthy eating. This literature has largely been done in elementary and adolescent-aged children. So how do we promote healthy eating? Well, we have strategically designed cafeterias. That sounds very fancy. But there's a couple of basic principles to design a cafeteria strategically. Number one, put fresh fruit right next to the cash register. So when you have impulse buys, we're not buying Rice Krispie treats, we're buying pears and apples. Right? Another way to design a cafeteria is simply thinking about how students go through the cafeteria line left to right. And if you actually put the healthy foods first and the junk foods last, they fill up their plate on healthy food and they have just a little bit of room left for junk food at the end. Another way that we can promote healthy eating is trayless dining. If you've ever been to a trayless dining cafeteria, it's kind of annoying because you have nothing really to balance everything on. But basically you have your 2 hands and you have your plate and you've got your cup and you don't have room for much else. And for kids that means they're not piling on chips and Rice Krispie treats on top of everything else. And then the final strategy that's been used has been looking specifically at the packages and the plates themselves. So thinking about the shapes, the size, and how we can influence eating in that way. And with respect to packages and plates, one of the things that we do is we actually try to influence the amount of food that's consumed, not just the type of food that's consumed. So we know for sure that large containers equal more food consumed and small containers equals less food consumed. So if you go to the movies tonight and you get the jumbo popcorn, you're going to eat way more popcorn than you ever intended. A second place where we can nudge people to have some positive outcomes in healthcare is overutilization. So there are several aspects of our healthcare system where we have overutilization, and I'll just talk about 2. One of the first is the use of antibiotics for for bacterial or viral-related infections. Okay, so if you go to your doctor, you are most typically presenting with symptoms like a cough, conjunctivitis, and so on that are really probably viral in nature. And so what we want to try to do is reduce the amount of prescribing of antibiotics for those kinds of situations. Why? Well, number one, then you're taking a medicine you didn't need, right? There's some side effects associated with taking an antibiotic. And number two, we are increasing the amount of antibiotic-resistant strains of bacteria, which we don't want to do, okay? So what are some of the ways that we can nudge physicians to not do this? Well, one of those that was mentioned in the previous hour was accountable justifications. So when a physician wants to make a prescription, all they have to do is simply write a short justification saying, this is why I want to prescribe this for this patient, and an accountable justification has significantly reduced the amount of prescribing of antibiotics for viral infections. Number two, requiring second opinions for tests and procedures of questionable value. Okay? Second opinions are not particularly popular in our country. But a lot of the work on this kind of stuff has come from the Netherlands. And in the Netherlands, when we ask for a second opinion, we can get questionable tests to be reduced in this particular way. Our third point is decreasing costs. So we can decrease costs by the use of generic drugs is one great way to do so. And generic drugs are obviously much cheaper than name brand drugs. And however, still providers do prescribe a lot of these name brand drugs. And so one of the ways that we can nudge people towards that is by setting the use of a default within the electronic medical record. We can default the generic drugs as the primary order of prescription. And then finally, we can use patient decision aids, which are tools that help patients understand that they have a choice between two equally successful treatments. And we can use those in conjunctions with treatments that have uncertain benefit. So there are several states, state of Washington, Vermont, some of the usual suspects, who have started to legislate the use of patient decision aids as a nudge for patients to consider whether or not they want to take a surgical treatment over diet and exercise when the two have similar outcomes. And both of these things, the generic drugs and the patient decision aids, have the effect of decreasing costs because you're talking about either a cheaper medication or a less invasive procedure. Okay. A couple last points here for discussion. I think we're going to see more nudges, period. Whether you're a nudge enthusiast or not, there's a lot of incentives that have been built into the Affordable Care Act that will cause people to probably create more meaningful use of this technology. So the High Tech Act of 2009 is one of those. And they're designed to create incentive payments that accelerate the meaningful use of health information technology. So initially, electronic medical records were designed to be record-keeping devices. In 2015 and 2016, incentives have been directed towards using those in a more meaningful way. What does that mean? Well, that means decision support. That means using things like nudges to help create care that's more uniform, that is more similar to the standards of care that the American Medical Association puts out. And so nudges are probably going to be a very important way that as we move forward, people take advantage of the meaningful use criteria to try to reach some of these solutions. So defaults, accountable justifications, second opinions, and whatnot. And there are several areas where I think this is going to be particularly useful. So health insurance enrollment, disease and lifestyle management, overutilization, and advanced care planning. And then finally, I think this is a really important point that was also emphasized in our first panel. It's important to have those nudges empirically tested. Sometimes the nudges don't work in the manner that we expect them to, and so empirically testing each of these nudges, even if they're part of the meaningful use criteria, is going to be something that we'll be advocating for moving forward. That being said, there's a lot of practical difficulty conducting randomized studies on health information. Part of that's because there's a lot of privacy protections around health data. So the group that we're working with is really calling for an extension of the depth and the breadth of research on health policy. So what does this mean? Well, in the case of health data, that means that we need to clarify some of the rules about who can conduct randomized studies on these nudges, and potentially that means granting regulatory exceptions when they're warranted to get access to private health data. Now, this might seem like a fairly restrictive or something that reaches beyond what we might standardly see. But I think there is some precedent for this. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau has the authority to grant regulatory exceptions to firms to facilitate research on consumer practices, and this has been used to shape consumer policy moving forward. And so just finally, to conclude, again with the flames, nudges are an effective method of increasing desired health behaviors and improving adherence towards clinical guidelines. More nudges are likely to be developed with this meaningful use criteria for the electronic medical record. So whether you're an enthusiast or not, I think this is part of our future. But again, I want to push that we need to continue studying the effectiveness of these nudges. And potentially that might mean getting access to health data that we haven't had before. And then finally, I think nudges are just simply one of the tools we have in our toolbox. So they're going to need to be used in combination with all the other tools to improve our health outcomes. Just a quick thank you, and this is the rest of the Behavioral Economics and Health Working Group from which I pulled our paper. Thank you.
Okay. I like to use my hands a lot, so I didn't want to like knock the table over or something while I was sitting, so I'm going to stand up during this one. And I don't have a PowerPoint, I'm just coming from my iPad here. So my title is Utilizing Behavioral Insights Without Romance, an Inquiry into Public Choice Architecture. So I have to first say I'm kind of stepping into, for somebody else who was supposed to be with us, Glenn Whitman, who has done some work with Mario Rizzo on nudging, and he calls, they call nudging or Libertarian paternalism, the new paternalism, so I had to throw that term out there. So the idea here, right, is that government typically solves problems due to perceived market failure, which is usually something where the institutions are not quite right. So the government can come in and correct things like market power, asymmetric information, public goods dilemmas, etc. So the new paternalism allows for a much wider range of policies because it's no longer just about institutions not working correctly, but people not working correctly, right? That we have to correct the behavior, not just the institutions. So definitely a much larger policy domain that government can intervene into now. And we've had that, of course, some of it's been mentioned, but consumer finance, environmental protection, tax compliance, I definitely agree that this is here to stay, and those things will just be broadening. But a very wise law professor said 12 years ago, a quote I'd like to read for us today. This is in the context of a paper he was commenting on about risk and terrorism. He says, the professor who had written this article advocates a government fix without first asking whether the government is institutionally capable of correcting individuals' affect-induced tendency to overestimate a risk of terrorism. This is a crucial oversight, since the answer to the question is probably no. As an initial matter, there is no reason to believe that bureaucrats are any less susceptible to cognitive quirks than the citizens they seek to protect. And more fundamentally, a democratically accountable agency faces institutional constraints that would render it incapable. If you haven't guessed, that professor is, of course, our Tom Lambert here today, and that was in the Mizzou Law Review. So, that quote sets up a lot of the comments that I'd like to make today with my time. Any attempt to manipulate private choice architecture, and I'm going to keep the use of that word in my presentation, I think, like Professor Grubb, I prefer that term to nudge for a variety of reasons. So any attempt to manipulate private choice architecture must invariably occur through the use of public choice architecture. And I think people who wish to apply behavioral insights that are not incorporating public choice architecture are losing control of their ideas. Without a proper accounting, the volatility in terms of actual policy outcomes is quite large. Is that the case? Are behavioral economists, BLE theorists, etc., are they not incorporating political outcomes and political considerations? Well, that's obviously something that needs to be measured. One of the attempts to do so was by a Professor Berggren in 2011. He found that 20% of behavioral articles published in top econ journals over a 10-year period recommended policy based upon behavioral insights, but only 5% of those articles even mention the policymaker. All right, which again is a pretty low bar for incorporating what I would term public choice architecture, as it's just talking about, again, the leader who's responsible. So let me tell you a couple of, before getting further into public choice architecture and why it's necessary, what it is, let me give you a couple of stories and quotes here that I think may break us out of this, these priors we might have of what the role of an economist or a legal theorist really is. So this first one is about a man in a hot air balloon. A man is flying in a hot air balloon and realizes he is lost. He reduces height and spots a man down below. He lowers the balloon further and shouts, "Excuse me, can you tell me where I am?" The man below says, "Yes, you're in a hot air balloon hovering 30 feet above this field." "You must be an engineer," says the balloonist. "I am," replies the man. "How did you know?" "Well," says the balloonist, "everything you have told me is technically correct, but it's no use to anyone." Okay, so possibly a little uncharitable to where obviously I'm thinking with positioning that. Let me give maybe a better quote on the other side of things. This is on what I would call kind of the welfarist interpretation of what behavioral economics can do. So this is from James Tobin, a Nobel laureate. In an interview, he said, "If we are advising government officials, politicians, voters, it's not for us economists to play games with them. I don't think that Jim Buchanan has, or I have, the right to withhold advice from presidents of the United States or members of Congress or the electorate on the grounds that if they knew what we know, they would misuse it. I don't think that is for us to decide." All right? So again, very clear in his opinion of that, and it's a valid opinion shared by, again, many practitioners in economics. But let's talk about who he was addressing there, James Buchanan, who of course won a Nobel Prize in '87 for his work on public choice. And this gets at the heart of where I'm going. So this is in his book, Politics Without Romance. He says, "It seems to be nothing more than simple and obvious wisdom to compare social institutions as they might be expected actually to operate, rather than to compare romantic models of how such institutions might be hoped to operate." Right? So to me, Buchanan's quote is a bit more than the role of an economist. It's about what is good economics. Or what is good legal theory. And I think, again, if we care about the actual outcomes that come from our ideas, then appreciating the public choice context in which those ideas will be formulated is vital to the success of our projects. So, taking that into account, what are some challenges I would offer to the new paternalism? Well, some of these have been mentioned so far, and I don't want to go like really into the weeds here, but I am going to say a few of them that maybe haven't been picked up. So actual political decision making is obviously going to be biased itself in a number of ways. There are bureaucratic incentives. Okay, there's an incentive structure in any agency, company, or other public place, organization that's going to actually facilitate these outcomes. There's the knowledge problem, the Hayekian knowledge problem that was mentioned before. There's confirmation bias among the practitioners, among the policymakers who are involved in this. It's very difficult for any of us to say that we're wrong. We have to wonder, again, is that tendency overemphasized or underemphasized in particular institutions? Finally, one I don't see as often in the literature, why do we seem to kind of believe that policymakers have the same preferences over outcomes relative to behavioral theorists? We certainly can't assume that is true, and I wonder if we couldn't do a better job of seeing how far apart those preferences really are. So in practice, if I have time to get to my work on the CFPB, I'm going to argue that regulations are far stronger than supported by behavioral insights alone. And this is a quote from Schnellenbach and Schubert that really kind of brings home this part of the presentation. They say, behavioral welfare economists are currently at risk of repeating the mistake of neglecting the real-world political process with its many intricacies. Under these conditions, policy advice addressed to an imaginary social planner may not only be useless, but even dangerous if it helps to promote policies that have unintended negative consequences under real-world conditions. I do believe empirical relevance matters, though. Like, is this actually happening, or is this fear-mongering? And I will describe again some points where I think this is a reality with the CFPB. Okay, a few other points about public choice architecture. Okay, what it is, what are some aspects that we would need to consider in thinking about our ideas in practice. First, I hear about the democratic check a lot, and that democracy is somehow a check on errant bureaucratic behavior. I'm not sure I always follow that, because one thing, if we know about the current election cycle, is that consumers are probably just as bad at making public choices as they are at making private ones. Or at least the jury is still out, certainly, I would think, given the outcomes we actually observe. But we have lots of theory to tell us why this is the case. We even have behavioral theory to tell us this is the case, right? So we've got public choice concerns like rational ignorance or rational irrationality. But we have, from Professor Sunstein's work, availability cascades. We know that the public can be fooled, especially in times of crisis, into getting behind something that sounds right, sounds appealing, but actually is untested and may be counterproductive. Talked about that one. The other thing I want to mention is that there is a field right now being described as behavioral public choice, which I think is very promising. And I think, don't get me wrong, I would like to see more work in that area. But I don't want us to consider that the limit of what public choice concerns can do for behavioral insights. Okay, so behavioral public choice to me is how are policymakers and political actors themselves biased, right? And we know that's important because there's going to be things like confirmation bias, there's going to be things like loss aversion, myopic behavior among politicians, okay? But I do want to stress in my presentation that that's really only a part of what public choice concerns are about. Thinking about the institutional constraints are just as if not more important, and understanding where the ideas would be acceptable. Another one, I don't see a lot of time alternative theories about how consumers misbehave or do things inappropriately. I see the kind of the neoclassical foil that behavioralists sort of position their own ideas to, but then saying that, okay, so people are imperfect. Well, how imperfect, right? I mean, obviously there's got to be some heterogeneity out there in the real world. Are we modeling that, or are we modeling it in a way that when the results come through, we're able to get over things like confirmation bias by saying, okay, we have a very sharp, clear prediction of what bad behavior looks like. Is it really that bad? Is it worse? Is it not as good? And I thought Professor Bubb's presentation was excellent in bringing some of that out. Okay, finally, before getting into the CFPB stuff, where am I on time? About 5 minutes. Okay, great. Experts, you know, I know that I saw from your video, Professor Sunstein, that you're a big fan of Yoda and the expertise of Yoda. Maybe we'll hear a little bit more about that at lunch. But I was actually a fan of Tyler Cowen's point that, you know, Yoda messed up a lot in those movies, and I think experts mess up a lot too. We have lots of evidence and work on experts, and we know they're very limited because we're limited. People are limited. And so I think there's sometimes kind of an over-reliance on experts will get it right, they'll figure it out, they just need to be in power. Okay, let me condense that very quickly because I want to get into CFPB. So very quickly, and I should point to my working paper with the George Washington University Regulatory Studies Center that's available online that brings all this out a lot more. So there is an institutional roadmap that behavioral theorists can use to evaluate their policies. I've condensed it down to just 3 items that would give us, I believe, a lot more clarity over the usefulness of the ideas, or at least the potential success of the ideas. Scope of authority, who holds power, and what does this authority entail in terms of, again, the choice architects, right? What is their power and what does their control look like? Transformation of outcomes, how do behavioral insights, how are they actually rendered into policy and practice, into law, into rules. And then finally, information retrieval. How is information actually collected and used by the agency? Thinking through those would again give us a lot more insight into success. Okay, quickly on the CFPB. The CFPB is going to sort of be my foil for an agency that I think gets a lot of behavioral insights wrong. It's part of Dodd-Frank reform. It's explicitly built on BLE foundations. It's headed by a single director who until very recently could not be removed once appointed. I think we're familiar, or most of us are familiar with the court ruling last week saying that is no longer going to be the case. Largely immune from congressional oversight as their budget is locked in as part of the Federal Reserve, and they can regulate virtually any credit product in the country, even those explicitly told not to, like auto loans and student loans. Okay, so a very powerful agency, even now after the ruling. Some of the things they've done, they've worked on things like qualified mortgages, making sure people can pay their mortgages. Unfortunately, when we look at the data, we see that there's been a reduction in overall mortgage originations. How certain are we that this is only bad mortgages being removed? Bank fees, going after bank fees that are considered burdensome or things that may fool consumers. Ironically, we now have more bank fees than we did before, but we have less of free checking accounts because those fees, of course, were used to compensate the banks in order to provide those services, low-cost checking accounts. I could go on. I've talked about auto lending and student loans. These are areas that the CFPB have moved into. In one case, it's not clear even what's the motivation for it, except that it's something they see as bad. In another one with auto lending, it seems from the pushback against that the very groups, minorities, that they're ostensibly trying to help are actually being harmed by the curtailment of credit in those areas. 2 minutes? 2 minutes? Sure. Okay. By comparison, I also talk about in the paper the Behavioral Insights team, which has a very, very different public choice architecture. It's a small independent group within the UK cabinet, or at least that's how it was initially founded. It's self-focused with low turnover. It has to work with other organizations because it virtually has no power on its own. So it has to work through consensus and proven results. The emphasis on how to get those results are on random control trials. That's how they collect information largely. And then learning through error. As far as I've been able to discern, it's a wildly popular team and has gone on to a lot of success. Okay, last slide. Synopsis of this. I think going along with some of the earlier remarks that we have to first come at this believing that consumer autonomy should be the default. I think any kind of messing with that without taking into account public choice architecture is a very dangerous tack. Data collection, I believe, needs to be randomly drawn. I think information retrieval should be cleaned up at the CFPB especially. I would say CFPB needs greater accountability to Congress, executive branch, and consumers, but luckily the federal court has agreed with me since writing that slide. By comparison, again, the BIT relies more on consensus, random control trials, and learning through error. So, in summary, I think the only way we're really effectively going to improve private choice architecture is with a better understanding of public choice architecture, and I hope my remarks have helped us in that manner. Thank you.
All right, well, thanks a lot, and thanks for having me here. It's great to be on a panel with so many people whose work I have thought a lot about. You know, hearing all the titles and all the different talks about the terminology here, it feels like there's like 10 different words, like choice architecture, nudges, libertarian, paternalist, and all the literature in the area since, you know, the original articles is just randomly taking them and like taking different combinations of the different words. And so I feel like I'm contributing to that a little bit here, but, so my apologies. as a motivation, so think of like a government savings plan, like the TSP that federal employees are opted into automatically these days. And you're the administrator who's running the plan, and you have a choice. So for people who sign up, and they don't specify, should their asset mix, what they're invested in, should it be risky or sort of more stable? And the risky one has higher return, but it's more risky. So, and just imagine that under the risky default, say like 70% of people end up with the risky allocation, and under the safe default, say like 40% of people do so. So it's a big difference in behavior, and you're the government, you're the administrator, your only job here, you're not trying to make a profit, you're just trying to do what's best for the people signing up. So how do you select the default without being paternalistic, and is it even possible to do so? So that's what I'll be looking at here. And what I'll argue is that basically under the standard view of paternalism, the answer is no. If you take the way that most people thought about paternalism, which is basically, I think, making policy assuming that people are not making mistakes, you can't really answer this question in a credible way. So I'll propose a new definition of paternalism, which I think captures some of the core concerns of the traditional definition, but could actually help take those concerns to guide the type of choice architecture policy questions we face. And then I'll give you a few reasons why I think it's a useful definition. So a little bit of throat clearing. When I say preferences, I mean, so people are choosing some options. When I say people's preferences, I mean the consistency of the different options with those people's values and priorities, so like whatever those are. I'll talk about a frame as sort of a particular implementation of choice architecture, either, for example, like one default or the other default, or maybe the order in which two options are presented on a list. And then a nudge, as the way I'm using the term, is basically choosing one frame or the other frame based on the idea that it's going to cause the decision maker to end up with an option that he or she more prefers, basically to avoid making a mistake. And so, linking back to this example, right, the choice is between the risky default and the safe default. The people have a preference between one of those or the other, but we might not know what it is as the policymakers. And then the frames are which default you implement. And then a nudge would be implementing one default or the other based on the idea that that's the way to improve people's choices, based on their own preferences. Okay, so what's the standard view of paternalism? I think this, there's a lot of different definitions out there. I think it basically boils down to the idea that being non-paternalistic requires making policy in a way that assumes that people are not making mistakes. They're given the available options and incentives, they're choosing what's best, what's most compatible with their preferences. And under that view, though, all nudges, as I'm defining it, are paternalistic, right? If you make the safe asset the default, the argument is that people would be making a mistake. They'd be picking the risky default. They'd be picking the risky asset mix if it was the risky default. But if you switch it to the safe asset default, they won't be making a mistake. That'll be what their choice is. And so under that view, you get all nudges are paternalistic. And basically, what would it require to do non-paternalistic policy here? You would basically need to say that in order for people not to be making mistakes, you would need to be saying that their preferences actually depend on what the frame is. And this is the core problem I have with the standard view of paternalism. So what would this mean in the default example about the asset mix? In order for somebody to for somebody who chooses the safe asset under the safe default and the risky asset under the risky default, right? So somebody whose choice is switching between those, for them not to be making a mistake under either one of those defaults, what you need to say is that their preferences over risk, over how they want to save for retirement, depend on something so arbitrary as the choices which is the default. And when you imagine when you see people choosing differently based on the list order, right? The order in which options are listed, for car insurance, say, or anything, you need to be, in order to pretend that those are not mistakes, you need to be saying that their preferences actually depend on the seemingly arbitrary factor. And that to me in many cases seems implausible. So I think basically if you want to be non-paternalist under the standard view, you're left making this assumption that really doesn't pass the laugh in the mirror test in a lot of cases. So this is what I'm going to argue for instead. is what I'm calling consistent choice paternalism. And to understand what I have in mind, it's useful to distinguish decision makers into two types. So you can imagine consistent decision makers, who are the people who are unaffected by the frame. The people who are choosing the same option regardless of what the default is. So those would be the people who choose the safe asset under the safe asset default and also under the risky asset default. You can also imagine the inconsistent decision makers, and those are the people whose behavior is actually affected. So the way that I'll define paternalism, or this modified view of paternalism, is that what paternalism requires, or is paternalistic if your goal as a policymaker is to improve the choices of the consistent decision makers. So in other words, what it means to be non-paternalistic is to say, if somebody is choosing in a way that's unaffected by the nudge, unaffected by the choice architecture, unaffected by these arbitrary factors, then we're going to respect their preferences. We're going to say that your choices actually tell us what you prefer, and we'll design policy with that view in mind. If, on the other hand, your choices are changing based on something that we are pretty sure is arbitrary, something that you don't actually care about, then your choices are not actually giving us useful information as to your preferences. And so we're not going to make this fanciful assumption that it actually is. And so that's what it requires. And you can understand this actually with respect to a lot of Greg's work, right, where there's so many people who, even in situations where the nudge, where the default is affecting 30% of the population, which is huge, it can be millions of people in some cases, that's still 70% of the people who are choosing consistently. And so what I'm saying, the idea of what it means to not be paternalistic here, is for that majority of the population, we actually want to take their choices seriously, not throw their choices out just because some other people are acting inconsistently. So this is weaker than the traditional definition of paternalism, right? We're saying it's accommodating choice reversals. We're saying that for the people who choose differently based on one frame versus another frame, then we're not actually going to assume that they're not making a mistake. We're going to say, you actually are making a mistake under one of these frames or the other one of the frames. The benefit, though, why I think it's useful and it sort of should be appealing to people who care about paternalism, is it actually captures this epistemic concern that traditionally motivates non-paternalists, right? It says that, like, if you are sending us a credible signal of your preferences, if you are behaving coherently, this minimally under this minimal definition of coherence, we are going to respect your preferences, and we should take that into account when designing policy. So I'll make 3 observations, and then hopefully save a lot of time for questions. So the first is that under my definition of paternalism, not all nudges are paternalistic, right? For example, if you have a nudge, or a difference in choice architecture, like the order of something on the list, something that doesn't impose any costs on the people who opt out, then all that matters for the optimal policy, which I show in other words, basically the insight is all that matters for optimal policy are the preferences of the inconsistent people, right? The people whose decisions are going to be swayed by the default. And in that situation, you don't need to be making an assumption one way or the other about the consistent choosers, and so you can't possibly be violating this non-paternalism requirement. On the other hand, you can also have nudges that are paternalist, right? Nudges differ in this dimension. So, for example, if you justify a nudge towards increasing retirement saving based on the idea that, like, everybody is a hyperbolic discounter, everybody is too impatient, and you need to be getting people to save more for the future than they otherwise would. Well, that justifies the nudge for the inconsistent people, but it also indicts the preferences of the consistent people. So there's a sense in which it's more paternalistic than the alternative. The other situation where you could be paternalistic here is where you have a nudge that does have some sort of not normatively relevant cost. It could be like a real cost, like paying money to switch the default, or it could be like a cognitive cost, like ordering something at the bottom of a list. That actually takes a lot of effort to go down the list. It takes up your bandwidth, and that's a normatively relevant cost. And in those situations, designing the optimal nudge, you do want to take into account the consistent people's preferences. And so in that case, what I'm saying, to be non-paternalist, you have to take their preferences as revealed by their consistent choices. The final observation I'll make on this point is that unlike nudges, mandates are actually paternalistic. And this thinking actually emerges out of it's sort of in response to a lot of Ryan's work. Where Ryan, I think, makes a persuasive case that if you only care about welfare, there's a lot of times where actually a mandate is more appealing than a nudge on welfareist grounds. The response here is that, well, so here's the argument. So suppose you're nudging towards a risky asset, right? You want to just make it the default. The inconsistent people, remember those are the people who are affected by the default, they're going to choose the safe asset if we nudge towards it. And the consistent people, right, some are going to choose the safe asset and some are going to opt out and go with the risky asset. What if we do a mandate? Well, in the case of a mandate, everybody's going to choose the safe asset. And so if we compare the difference between the different groups, right, the inconsistent people, there's no difference in their behavior. The consistent people, the only people who behave differently are the ones who would have opted out of the default, right? And so in order to prefer the mandate over the nudge, you have to be willing to assume that the consistent choosers are actually making a mistake, right? And that's the very definition of that's the very definition that I'm proposing for paternalism. So sort of stepping back, what this is saying is that not only might you prefer a nudge over a mandate for reasons of preserving choice, so it's not only more liberal than a mandate, it's also less paternalistic in this important sense. So just to conclude, I'll say that if you take the standard view of paternalism, you're sort of left between a rock and a hard place. Either everything is paternalistic, and it's not sort of a useful tool for choosing between different types of nudges or choosing choice architecture, or you have to make sort of a silly assumption. And what I'm proposing is a way to sort of import the traditional anti-paternalist concerns into the project of choosing the best choice architecture in a way that could actually give us some traction between choosing different nudges. The final point is that it's not actually, is that there's, even among the types of choices that I'm calling as non-paternalistic, there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of thinking about the concerns of paternalism. And by this I mean, the question is, how do you decide whether somebody is choosing consistently or inconsistently? So it's pretty easy, I think, with a default, right, where somebody's choices about retirement, like tens of thousands of dollars potentially over the course of their lifetime, I think comparing that to the sort of trivial cost of opting in or out, I think it's pretty clear that that's actually an inconsistency. Or when you see something like, whether to claim a tax benefit based on the font of the form, right? That's something where it's pretty clearly an arbitrary difference causing a real difference in behavior. But I think it's harder in other cases. So one case where you wouldn't say it's an inconsistency is, say you're choosing between ice cream and hot chocolate, and you see one time people choose ice cream, and one time people choose hot chocolate, but the thing that's changing is, it was winter over here and summer over here, right? That we wouldn't want to say that's an inconsistency, because we would think that the season is relevant to preferences. Or what about, like, you see that people are willing to drive and take like a 1 out of 1,000 risk of an accident driving on a highway, but they're not willing to take the same risk of an accident when they're flying on an airplane, even though the risk is lower, right? Would we want to sort of step in as an outside observer and say that's an inconsistency? And it seems like the more aggressive you are about throwing out some choices as inconsistent with one another, that's another dimension where these sort of paternalistic concerns are relevant and should get more attention than they're being given right now. Thanks.
Questions? Right.
I'm going to ask a particular clarifying question. I totally understand the definition of paternalism you offer. So, to see if I do, is it the case that anything that Cass would call libertarian paternalism, going back to the original definition of not putting material costs on any option, taking away any options, just reframing the choice in some fashion? So is it the case that any policy that's a libertarian paternalism policy, by his definition, would count as a non-paternalistic policy according to your definition?
So no, I think that the difference is that I'm really thinking about paternalism as about the justification being offered for the policy. So the question for me, and I think really the question sort of unifying way that a lot of people have in mind for paternalism is it's about whether you're, under the standard view, is whether you're making policy assuming that people are, if left to their own, they'd be making a mistake or not from their own preferences. And what my view is saying is, it's still about whether a policy is paternalistic or not, still depends on the justification for the policy. And the question is just whether that the assumptions going into sort of the welfare analysis or whatever is that the people who are insensitive to the nudge, who are choosing consistently, whether you're assuming that they're making a mistake or not. And so if you're willing to assume that the people who are choosing consistently are not making a mistake, and you get to a particular nudge based on that, that's not paternalistic. So, like, you know, I think in one of the examples in Cass's work, right, he'll talk about retirement savings plans, and some of the arguments I think that he offers are sort of paternalistic ones under my definition, because they sort of apply equally to the consistent people and the inconsistent people, and that would be things like impatience or hyperbolic discounting. And other of the arguments that he offers for it, saying that, like, well, of the people who are inconsistent, when you go and talk to them, they sort of wish they were saving more. I think that would be non-paternalistic.
So I was sure also there is a connection. It may not be exactly the same, but the connection conceptually between libertarian paternalism and your proposed definition of paternalism is the true libertarian paternalist policy. By your definition of consistency, the consistent decision makers are not effective. That's what you mean. That's how you define consistency. Therefore, it seems unlikely that a true libertarian paternalism policy is motivated by a concern of mistakes among consistent decision makers, since after all, their choices are unaffected.
Well, but when you're
see the
saying,
link here?
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think that holds when the nudge you're considering, or the choice architecture you're considering, is sort of the purest sense, where there's no sort of normatively relevant costs to opting out, where you're like changing the order on a list, for example.
Yes.
But if you're changing something, and I think a lot of past examples fall into this category, where, you know, it might be better to make one out, like the safe asset mix, the default, because it's a lot of work and a lot of effort to figure out which option you would prefer, and people don't have sufficient bandwidth. In those sort of situations, right, like, so suppose that like 90% of the consistent people actually, if they had to make a choice, they would end up choosing the safe option. And but you decided instead to make the risky option the default, right? Like, in getting that analysis, you would be sort of overriding the preferences of the consistent decision makers, the consistent people who actually would have preferred the safe option.
Because you wouldn't say this is a failure of consistency by them. You say, look, there are real costs being imposed.
Exactly. You're forcing them to opt out. Yeah.
Yeah, to make this clarifying, so this is great, your paper, I think. And so to clarify this exchange, I think this will, I'm hopeful that this will help. You're drawing distinction between self-evidently irrelevant factors as manifested by choice behavior as a form of bounded rationality. As, for example, when people are demonstrating framing effects or default effects. That's one category, and another category, let's call it systematic bias, possibly, where people aren't showing self-evidently inconsistent behavior. But they might be just, you know, smoking a ton or overeating or failing to save.
Right.
And there you're not seeing by revealed preference that. You're saying in the first case, we don't really have a paternalism problem because people are making self-evidently inconsistent choices, so there isn't a preference that. Okay, that's great. So
that's exactly right.
That's helpful. So that is very plausible, and it kind of works. The question I'd ask is whether it's right to use revealed preferences as the, or whether it's clearly right to use the revealed preferences as the arbiter, or whether it's controversial to do that. And whether we might see in the second category, once we start interrogating people, where they're showing present bias or optimistic bias or availability bias, whether they wouldn't buy their own bites, start getting puzzled about inconsistency in terms of what they care about. But I think to dissolve your distinction, this is the first time I thought about this, so see if this is right, you have to abandon revealed preferences as the arbiter and start asking people about their judgments, something like that.
Yeah, so I'm already stepping back from revealed preference just because the pure application of revealed preference would imply that under frame 1 you prefer X, under frame 2 you imply Y, even when the frame is something arbitrary. And I think you're exactly right that the question is sort of how far you want to go in doing that. So you could imagine that, like, you know, one of the frames is, do you smoke cigarettes? Just normally, and then the frame, the choice architecture is let's give you like a week-long reflect, you know, all the information. We'll have you reflect on it, like talk to your doctor, your loved ones, and then see if you choose the same answer. And if you switch, you know, you can imagine that being sort of the inconsistency that you want to treat there. I think that I think that I am, you know, I'm not a paternalist really, even under this definition. I mean, an anti-paternalist under this definition. I think there's times when revealed preferences is wrong, but if you never really see somebody choosing the other option, even when sort of conditions are as favorable to them as possible, for choosing that other position, I'm a little more hesitant about you know, as a matter of policy, sort of treating that as the proper outcome for them.
Right.
Yeah, I think this builds on what you two were just talking about. So I think Cass certainly would accept that this evidence of an inconsistency or susceptibility to supposedly irrelevant feature of the design of the choice architecture, such as framing effects, could be seen as justification for the intervention. And you would even go so far as to say that's not even paternalism, right? And that's the point I want to press you on. It's one thing to say there's an inconsistency in choice, which I think we will often see, and I think that can justify some interventions. But it's another thing to say that there's no preference there underneath that we are supplanting with the nudger's preference. It seems to me what's crucial to the paternalism is we are imposing on that, what you call the inconsistent chooser, the nudger's preference, instead of taking the steps like you use with the smoker. I don't see the inconsistent chooser any different than Cass's rational addiction or whatever, the smoker. In both cases, we've got somebody who we just don't know what their real preference would be. And so to me, it's puzzling that the mere inconsistency would be enough to say we don't have paternalism going on. I can imagine a revelatory frame, to use the economist language, where we actually put them through both manipulations, and then we're going to know whether they're, you know, which framing is their true choice, if they've actually been under both conditions. Then we can see what the preference. But you're making no effort at all.
So I guess actually I think we might be talking past each other a little, because I really see the basic project of nudging like very different than how you described in your talk, where it's about substituting the policymaker's preference in. And I just don't think that in most of the situations I've thought about, I think it's all, you know, there's some difference in choice architecture. Or in the cases I'm talking about as not being paternalistic, you know, we just know that whatever we make the default is going to affect choices, how we draw the highway line, what you know, sort of the auto insurance example is in your state. It's going to affect people's behavior. We know that. I'm the policymaker. I'm the plan administrator. I don't have a strong view. I just want to do what's best for the people, you know, whose choices are going to be affected. And how do we get an answer to that that's not paternalistic? And that's the project I'm looking at here. So I don't think it's about, you know, substituting in anyone else's views for the individual. It's about trying to figure out what that individual's views are, and different processes for getting to that result are either paternalistic or not paternalistic.
So I have a question. I hope it's not outside the scope of what you're talking about, but it's more of a practical issue. So I'm curious when you say that there's, I guess, sets of consistent preferences for any set of choices. And maybe when there's only one or two choices, it's easier to comprehend. But what are the practical implications of designing an optimal choice architecture under your view of paternalism when there's maybe 10 choices or 20 different choices?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a really hard question. I actually don't think so. If you met a good example of this issue where this comes up is student loan repayment plans, where, you know, I guess if you don't know, you'll see very quickly when you graduate law school, right? There's different, you know, there's sort of a default of 10-year repayment, and then which is very aggressive, and then there's 20 or 25 or income-based repayment, and lots of different alternatives. And, you know, from what we know from all this research, what the default is probably going to be very sticky. And we also know that probably 10-year repayment is not optimal for lots and lots of graduates. And so the question is, like, even if we had perfect randomized data, you know, to know the behavioral effects of putting different people in different default plans, how that would affect their choices, going from that information to the optimal policy I don't think anyone really knows the right answer. I'm working on that in other work, but I think it's basically a really hard question. Like, to give you a little bit of an answer is, you could imagine, in some cases, you can imagine making the choices binary. So sort of the 10-year plan versus all other plans, and treating those categories and sort of trying to figure out an answer there and sort of doing that for each of the different options. But I think it's a great question. I don't know if you have like a insider.
I guess I was going to say, well, so do you believe it's more of an issue that will just be solved by collecting more data, or do you think it's just too complex to solve right now?
No, I don't think it's a computational problem. I think it's just, you know, you have to be, I think the general tension here is that, you know, like Kat was saying, the sort of less closely you're rooted in revealed preference, which is how sort of welfare economists have been able to solve these problems historically. You have to impose some other model, some other set of assumptions about how people are choosing. And as you get sort of more and more options, you sort of be needing to make more and more restrictive assumptions, or different types of assumptions rather, give you sort of different welfare answers for what's the best default to use. And so I think sort of the tension and where a lot of the work will be in the next, you know, 10 years or so, will be trying to understand how you can answer these questions in a way that's not really sensitive to the specific assumptions you're making about why people make mistakes one way versus another way, or one psychological mechanism or another. John.
So David, conceptually, I think I'm on board with you, but practically speaking, how do you determine what are the irrelevant frames, right? So, you know, if I have to make a choice about buying some furniture with my wife, and she says, oh, I really like this chair, and then we paint the room, and she says, I hate that chair. Right? To my mind, that's a stupid, irrelevant kind of frame, right? But to her, it's a very real and actually has kind of welfare effects. Do you have some kind of practical way as to distinguish between what's relevant and irrelevant here?
So I think it's, I'll start, maybe this is a good academic way, I'll start by saying it's a really, really hard problem that no one's ever been able to solve, and then I'll say so the place where this comes up is just all the way from like Samuelson, right? There's a debate between Samuelson and Amartya Sen about revealed preference, where Samuelson says, look, I have revealed preference, this could be a totally modular, judgment-free way of figuring out if people are making mistakes or not. We just see if choices are inconsistent. And Amartya Sen comes in and says, well, no, we still need the modeler to, or the outside person to come in and say, if you choose differently, is there something sort of preference, relevant, different about those two situations? And so you can imagine, like the ice cream versus hot chocolate example I gave, right? There we're saying it looks like a conflict, but it doesn't actually sort of falsify revealed preference. Whereas other situations like a default or the order that, like whether, you know, the font that something is written in, those seem much more plausible to do it. But I think you need to make these outside assumptions.
More plausible to whom?
I think you have to make that argument, yeah. But so here's the one approach that I think that I'm working on for dealing with this, is that you can sort of substitute that assumption for another type of assumption. And so you can imagine, there's lots of work recently in psychology about like cognitive load and how other sort of decision-making constraints could like exacerbate biases. So if you like sort of imagine subjecting people to cognitive load, like a lot of cognitive load or a little cognitive load, and you see these biases get a lot worse, that's a little suggestive that this is actually a bias going on. Whereas if you see this effect being the same in both cases, that's more consistent with it actually being a preference. Because you wouldn't, or you can imagine like telling somebody about the bias and seeing if their behavior changes. And if their behavior changes, you wouldn't think that that's actually a preference. So you might be able to get a little traction that way.
Well, I wanted to ask Adam a question. I understand and agree with your points about the need for taking into account public choice concerns, policy design level, but it seems to me if we just think of nudge broadly as a regulatory tool to go along with what Tom was calling bans and commands and incentives, would your concerns be greater or lesser about the CFPB or whatever agency if we assume that nudges do truly have, at least for the consistent choosers, have an opt-out that's meaningful? So does that not, isn't that adding that to the toolbox, isn't that an efficient move, or are you concerned that the inconsistent choosers are more easily going to be duped by the regulator if they don't realize they're falling prey to the default? So I guess I wondered, how serious are the public choice concerns less when the regulator chooses the nudging approach versus the more traditional paternalistic tools?
Sure. Well, even in your comments just there in the presentation earlier, I mean, you're assuming a lot of things here, like that this nudge is going to be taken at face value by the regulator, but the regulator wants the same outcome as the behavioralist. In other words, we're still pitching into the black box, and I'm saying open up the black box. So if under examination we found that that happened and they chose that device, I think I'd be more interested in why they chose that device and how we could get them to choose devices like that in the future than I would even with the results of the device itself, if that makes sense. I would be very interested in the process by which we're able to achieve outcomes that we think are desirable, rather than the arguments here we're getting whether it's truly a desirable outcome or not.
So Jacob, back to this conception of paternalism. So I'm having trouble understanding why this conception of the term paternalism would be useful for someone like you, who I take it in your work, you seem like a welfarist just like me. Or like me in that dimension. And you mentioned in your remarks here today that you're not an anti-paternalist. I know we're taking you to be one. So, as you referenced, I've been critical of libertarian paternalism for drawing what are ultimately, I argue, counterproductive distinctions between explicitly coercive tools and effectively coercive tools and nudges. That's led to disabling of some of our cost-benefit analysis. And I worry that you're engaged in a very similar enterprise, where we now have a conception of paternalism, which you've defined, think about Greg's comment. There are lots of things that Greg and I would look at and say, oh, that's paternalism. You say, no, I got a new definition, that's not paternalism. And the message is, and this connects it to Adam's work, the message is, great. No need to be careful about it because it's not paternalism. But you're a welfarist. What do you care about these labels? So explain to me why this is useful. Just forgive me for the challenging tone. I think it was an opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the epistemic concern is real, and I think that this is it's not overbearing. It shouldn't be like a Dan's logical objection, like if it's paternalist, then you don't do it. But it's sort of a proceed with caution, and not with caution.
It was not paternalist.
Well, you got to do something if you're not in this situation, I think. And this is where I think that all the inevitability of choice architecture, when you just have to set one default or the other, it's inevitable, but you can do it in a way that's not paternalistic. You don't have to believe that there's some other sort of underlying bias poisoning people's choices, other than the fact that you actually see they behave differently under one default or the other default. So you just got to do something there. When you're sort of you sort of believe there's some other bias going on, like people are eating unhealthy food or not saving enough for retirement, and then you reach into your toolbox to find a way to address it, that feels qualitatively different to me. And I think it's often justifiable and could be a good idea, and sometimes not in others, but you just sort of have to realize that you're taking an extra step there and you're being, and so basically part of my argument is to say, I'm sort of throwing those sort of tools a little under the bus to say that, well, even all you people who care about paternalism, let's at least agree that this set of tools is uncontroversial, and the place where you should be focusing your attention on this other set of interventions.
So I have a question for Professor Schaffer. So something I was actually curious about is you mentioned accountable justification and how it reduces the incorrect application of antibiotics. So I was curious, so I feel like maybe that's an unfair thing to say on face of it. Wouldn't it putting any barrier between execution, reduce application, of any medication across the board?
Okay, so your question is why that particular, wait, reframe the information.
So maybe this is a better way to put it. So the idea of countable justification, of having to write something up before you do something, ideally in the scenario you described, it reduced incorrect usage or suboptimal usage of antibiotics, right?
Correct.
But it seems to me that maybe that's an unfair thing to say, because I feel like wouldn't putting any barrier between execution of giving a medicine to anyone reduce just impact across the board, or application across the board?
So why that justification versus any other kind of barrier, what you're saying?
Exactly.
Actually, that doesn't seem to be the case. So there have been a couple of comparative effectiveness studies looking at different kinds of prohibitions within the electronic medical record, or instructions, or lectures about the context. And so it seems that accountable justification wins out in that case in terms of reducing the this particular prescribing of antibiotics in cases that are viral. So for some reason, accountable justification seems to be better than other kinds of prohibitive strategies. Is that what am I getting your question?
I guess it was half of it. The other half was, what about accountable justification reduces it in the case of antibiotics, and not maybe accountable justification applied to whether or not you should splint up a bone, or accountable justification applied to getting blood work from somebody? Wouldn't putting any barrier to reduce any application across the board. Just the idea of putting a barrier in front of something.
Well, yeah. I mean, so I think that's why you don't consistently apply accountable justification for every procedure that you're ordering, right? So you target particularly things where you think they're overused, with the hope specifically of getting people to use that less. And I think that's the prescribed purpose. Yeah. You're giving me a face like I still didn't answer your question. You want to try again? Did I miss some?
Yeah. I'll take a shot at it. Are you also reducing the number of people prescribing when they should be prescribed?
Well, I think, so here's what makes things difficult, right? How do you answer that question? Right. Who was right to prescribe and who was wrong to prescribe? And so what we've got is a population level health data problem, where we know that at the population level, there is more prescribing going on than is possibly useful given the rate of viral infections and bacterial infections. Right. And so that makes it difficult on the individual level to say, in this case, is this correct or is this incorrect?
Unless you've got evidence that it is a bacterial infection.
Right, and that's the only, and sometimes you can with an antibiotic, but sometimes you can't, right? So there's not a clear test of that, and just simply applying an antibiotic, well, a virus may have the same course of time and may have gotten better naturally anyway, whether you give that
I would hope the doctors would not be so lucky or lazy that they would just say, this is too much work, I'm not going to do it.
Well, but there's not a clear test. So I think in the individual case, it's a really difficult thing to say, hey, we've made a mistake, we've made the correct decision, right? And so I think that's where it is up to a doctor to say, let's see, we've got a cough, it's been hanging around for about 2 weeks. Sometimes bacterial infections build on top of viral infections. And in my best judgment here, I'm afraid that's what's happening to this patient. So I'm going to go ahead and prescribe an antibiotic, even though typically this is a viral situation, right? Again, we have no way of knowing whether that's ever that was the correct decision or not. The patient will ultimately get better, maybe because the virus went away, or maybe because the bacterial infection, that was actually reduced by the use of the antibiotic. So it's really hard to measure on an individual basis whether each of these were correct decisions. And so we simply have population level data that says clearly we've got too much of this, but we can't say in which case it's correct, in which case it was too much, in which case it was appropriate. And that's what makes it particularly challenging.
Right.
Any last questions?
Yeah, so I guess this is maybe just a little question about the application of Jacob's consistency-based approach. But are there going to be particular types of people or particular types of preferences that this is going to sort of weight? And I guess what I'm thinking about is, to the extent that some people tend to get additional information from frames, as per Plain Chen's work, those are the people whose preferences are going to look most inconsistent, yes? And the people whose preferences are going to look most consistent are the ones who are going to be, on the whole, less sensitive to contextual cues. So at an extreme, people in the autism spectrum, for example, tend to have difficulty with contextual cues. So their preferences may look quite consistent, but nevertheless, that seems like
we may be selecting for the thing that we're not meaning to select for.
And that overlaps with economists, right? So
I was gonna say, did she just call all economists?
So I mean, I guess basically, I think it's a great project, but I'm just wondering what happens when we start to think about variability across persons and the practices of consistency, and sometimes maybe there's meaningful inconsistency insofar as people are responding to information in frames, and so I know that you're obviously flagging yourself the difficulties of figuring out what counts as inconsistency, but I'm saying sometimes inconsistency actually valuable. So.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. So two responses. So first, when there's information in the frame, I think often that's actually a situation where it's not even a mistake. Where like an economist would say, oh, that's totally rational, maybe it's advice, I don't know what's the best one for me, but I trust my employer has thought it through. And so that wouldn't necessarily even be a pure mistake or like a failure of real preferences. But on your, I think what your real question is, it's a great point. So like one application, one way to implement my approach to be non-paternalistic were to say you figured out the preferences of the consistent people, and then you just assume that the inconsistent people have the same preferences as they had, right? If you believe that, then actually this whole epistemic problem, the whole information problem of setting nudges would just be gone, because you could, under at least some assumptions, figure out what the consistent people prefer. The problem with that is exactly the sort of things that you're flagging, where, for example, the people who are consistent might be because they're missing contextual clues, or it could be for things like they care more about the issue, they care more about the choice, and that's something that somebody mentioned earlier. It could be that they're better educated, that they understand, more, they have maybe like more time to make the decision, or they've faced similar decisions before. All those sort of factors mean that the consistent group could be totally different in their preferences than the inconsistent group. And then so that raises a challenge for when you're actually trying to set the policy. And you can do things like adjust for observables. Obviously it's hard to like maybe measure if you're outside like who's autistic or who's on that spectrum or to the extent, besides looking at the profession. Yes, I think it's a really important point to keep in mind.
Well, before we thank our second panel, maybe we should review. We have at 11:45, Professor Sunstein will be giving us a talk on the world, what we can learn about the world from Star Wars, and that'll be in room 7? Room 7.
Here.
Oh, sorry, not room 7. This room, the courtroom. And then we'll reconvene at 1 o'clock for his keynote address. So
In room 7.
that will be in room 7. Thank you. So now, please join me in thanking